A millionaire finds twin girls, crying on Christmas Eve. What he discovers changed his life forever. The snow was falling slowly, painting the streets of New York with a silent white blanket. It was as if time had stopped on that Christmas Eve, while the lights in the windows and on the street lamps shone like promises of joy and hope. But for Jonathan Blake, the city's glow was just a cruel reminder of the emptiness he carried. At 45, Jonathan was a successful man anyone would envy. He had a fortune that financed unimaginable luxuries, properties in the most desirable places in the world, and a name that dominated the most exclusive circles. Inside him, however, there was only darkness. His life seemed like a maze with no way out, a collection of soulless achievements. It had been like that since the day he decided to cut ties with his family, moving away from the parents and siblings he now remembered only with regret. That night, like every Christmas Eve in recent years, Jonathan was alone. He had just left a corporate dinner, one of those obligatory meetings that mixed falsehood with tedious protocols. His perfectly tailored suit and cashmere scarf did nothing to warm the chill he felt inside. He refused a ride from his driver, preferring to walk through the frozen streets, perhaps in the hope of finding some peace amid the silence of the city. The driver then stopped the car further away and stayed there. He knew that Jonathan could change his mind at any moment. Meanwhile, Jonathan walked through the streets with steady steps, his hands in his pockets, his gaze lost. Everything was a blur, the lights on the buildings, the distant sound of laughter and Christmas carols, the sweet aroma of roasted chestnuts being sold from makeshift carts. Jonathan hated Christmas. For him, it was a nagging reminder of what he had lost, or rather, what he had chosen to leave behind. He turned the corner of an almost deserted park when something unusual caught his eye. Under the dim light of a communal Christmas tree, humbly decorated and adorned with cheap ornaments, he saw two small figures sitting in the snow. He stopped, frowning. Who would be there in the cold at that hour? He tried to ignore it, but something was wrong. A low sound reached him, a muffled sob that seemed to cut through the icy air. Jonathan felt a tightness in his chest, a discomfort he couldn't explain. Against his own nature, he moved closer. The two girls were identical, perfect twins. Their golden hair framed pale faces reddened by the cold, and their big blue eyes were swollen from crying. They wore thin, worn-out coats, clearly not enough to protect them from the harsh winter. One of them was hugging the other, as if trying to protect them from the world, even though they were so small and fragile. "What are you doing here?" Jonathan's voice came out harsher than he had intended, almost scaring the girls. The one who seemed to be the bravest looked up, her eyes glistening with barely contained tears. "We're waiting for Mommy." "Waiting? Here?" He looked around, but there was no one, just icy silence and the occasional rustle of the wind. "Where's your mom?" "She said she was going to get some food and would be back soon," the girl replied, her voice breaking. "But it's been a long time." Jonathan felt a twinge of irritation, mixed with something he hadn't recognized for years. Concern. "How long have you been here?" The other girl, who until then had been silent, murmured quietly, "I think since the beginning of the night." Jonathan ran a hand over his face, trying to contain his frustration. It didn't make sense. Who would leave two children alone in a frozen park in the middle of Christmas? "You can't stay here," he finally said, his voice softer. "How you'll freeze." The older girl squeezed her sister's arm. "But what if Mommy comes back? What if she doesn't find us?" He took a deep breath, looking at the innocent, frightened faces. Something inside him, something he believed to be dead, began to stir. He knew he couldn't just move on. "Come on," he said, holding out his hand. "I'll help you find your mother." The girls hesitated, but the cold was relentless. Finally, the eldest held Jonathan's hand, while the youngest leaned on her sister. He led them to a nearby restaurant, where they could warm up while he decided what to do next. The warmth of the restaurant was an immediate relief for the girls. They sat down at a table, while Jonathan ordered something hot for them to eat. He watched them carefully, trying to piece together the inexplicable situation. Who were they? And who was this mother who had left them behind? When the plates arrived, the girls ate with a voracity that made Jonathan feel a lump in his throat. They were hungry, that much was clear, but he still couldn't avoid the mystery that hung over them. "What's your name?" he asked, as the snow continued to fall outside. "I'm Chloe, and she's my sister, Clara," replied one of them, her mouth still full of food. How old are you? 6, they said in unison. Jonathan nodded slowly. He looked out into the darkness as his mind worked frantically. Where was this mother? And why did he feel such a strange urgency to protect them? Suddenly the door of the restaurant opened with a bang, and a woman walked in, her eyes wide with despair. She was poorly dressed, her hair disheveled and her face marked by cold and anguish. When her eyes landed on the girls, she let out a relieved cry. Chloe! Clara! The girls ran to her, hugging her tightly. Jonathan stood still, watching the scene with a mixture of relief and suspicion. Who was this woman? And how had she let this happen? He didn't know, but that night had only just begun, and something inside him was already changing. What he didn't imagine was that this unlikely encounter would transform his life in ways he could never have foreseen. Jonathan, still skeptical about his mother's story, feels a strange need to know more about her and the girls. As he watches the family gather, an unexpected idea begins to form in his mind. He can't leave them alone that night. The woman who entered the restaurant was a vision of despair. Her light brown hair was disheveled, her skin reddened by exposure to the cold, and her eyes were full of panic and exhaustion. The woman's thin arms wrapped tightly around them, and she collapsed to the floor, sobbing loudly as she hugged them, as if she would never let go again. Jonathan watched the scene from his desk, his face impassive, but his heart confused. Part of him wanted to feel relief that the girls had found their mother again. Another, harder part, questioned how she could have left them alone in that frozen park for so long. Are you all right? Oh my God, I was so worried. The woman stroked the girls' hair as they cried on her shoulder. We're fine, Mommy, said Chloe, her voice muffled against her mother's coat. That man helped us. The woman raised her eyes to Jonathan, as if only now noticing his presence. She stood up, still holding her daughters, and walked over to him. I don't know how to thank you, she began, her voice trembling. I didn't know what to do. I thought I'd lost them. Jonathan remained silent for a moment, assessing her. He could see the genuine fear in her eyes, but he also noticed the shadows of shame. Where were you? They said you went to look for food. The woman hesitated, clearly struggling for words. She swallowed before replying. Yes, I went. But as there were problems, I was waiting in line at a church that distributed meals, but there were so many people. When it was my turn, they had nothing left. Jonathan arched an eyebrow. Her frankness took him by surprise. So, I tried a shelter, she continued, looking away. But it was full. And then, I didn't know what to do. The twins looked at her with innocent eyes, not fully understanding the weight of their mother's words. But Jonathan understood. That was the reality of living on the edge of the abyss, where every decision was an act of survival. What's your name? He asked, his voice low but firm. Grace, she replied, with an almost imperceptible nod. Grace Miller. He fell silent again, thoughts spinning in his mind. He knew he should just get up and leave. He had already done more than enough. The girls were safe. Their mother was there. It wasn't his problem. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't ignore the uncomfortable feeling in his chest. Grace sat down with her daughters, and Jonathan gestured for the waiter to bring her something to eat. When the plate arrived, she looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude. Thank you, she said, her voice almost a whisper. He just nodded, as if he didn't want to admit that this gesture of kindness was something completely out of his routine. While Grace ate and the girls rested beside her, Jonathan finally broke the silence. Why are you in this situation? She stopped chewing, clearly uncomfortable with the question. After a moment, she sighed deeply and replied, I used to work as a receptionist in a clinic, but I was fired a few months ago. I tried to find another job, but no one wants to hire someone like me, with 2 small children and no one to look after them. She looked at her daughters, her expression softening but with a touch of sadness. I did what I could to keep a roof over our heads, but it wasn't enough. I lost our apartment a few weeks ago. Since then, we've been surviving as best we can. Jonathan felt a tightness in his chest when he heard those words. There was something about Grace, the strength she tried to show despite her desperate situation, that touched him in a way he couldn't explain. He looked away, staring at the snow falling outside. His mind was pulled into a flash of memory, like a window opening onto the past. It was a Christmas many years ago. He was 25, and in the dining room of his parents' house, a mansion that seemed even bigger on that silent night. His mother had prepared an impeccable dinner as always, and his father was on the phone as always. Jonathan was furious. "You don't understand, Dad," he said, his voice full of anger. "I don't want to follow the path you've laid out for me. I'm not you." "You are my son, Jonathan," replied his father, his voice as cold as ice, "and you will do whatever is necessary to honor this name." Jonathan stood up abruptly, his chair creaking against the floor. "Honor the name? You don't even care about the family, just your damn company." His mother tried to intervene, but Jonathan was already leaving. It was the last time he spent Christmas with them. The memory disappeared as quickly as it came, leaving Jonathan with a bitter taste in his mouth. He blinked, turning back to the present, where Grace was watching him with a curious but cautious expression. "I'm sorry," she said, as if she felt she was asking too much. "I don't know why I'm telling you all this. You've already done so much for us. I'll never forget what you did for my girls today." Jonathan wanted to say something. He wanted to say that she didn't need to apologize, that he understood more than he seemed to, but the words got stuck in his throat. He looked at the girls, who were now dozing in their mother's arms, and then something inside him, a spark of something he thought he'd lost a long time ago, began to grow. "You can't spend the night in the street," he said, finally breaking the silence. Grace looked at him, surprised. I don't know what to do. I have nowhere to go." Jonathan took a deep breath, as if he were making the hardest decision of his life. "I know what to do, but you'll have to trust me." Grace hesitated, looking at him, then at her daughters. Why are you doing this?" He didn't have a clear answer. He just knew he couldn't leave them alone. "Because no one should spend Christmas like this," he finally replied, his voice low but full of determination. Jonathan picked up the phone and called someone, giving mysterious instructions. Grace watched, uncertain of what would come next, but sensing that something special was about to happen. Jonathan stood still for a few seconds, the phone still in his hand, his gaze fixed on the snow falling outside. The decision he had just made seemed out of character, something impulsive but inevitable. He felt that there was no choice. Something compelled him to act, even against the cold silence he had built around himself for so many years. He disconnected the call with a soft sigh and turned to Grace, who was holding the girls in a protective embrace. She was exhausted, and the worry on her face was evident even when she tried to disguise it. The twins were dozing, their rosy cheeks from the cold now warmed by the restaurant's atmosphere. "You're coming with me," said Jonathan at last, his voice firm but almost welcoming. Grace blinked, stunned. "Sorry, what?" "Come to my house," he repeated. "You shouldn't spend Christmas like this, it's not right." Grace was silent for a moment. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she squeezed the girls tighter, as if she didn't want to let go. I don't know what to say. I can't accept it. You've already done so much." "It's not a question of accepting or not," he said, cutting off any attempt to refuse. "I'm not leaving 2 children and a mother on the street tonight, so come on, it's as simple as that." Grace hesitated. She looked at the girls, then at Jonathan. He had an expression she couldn't decipher, something between determination and something deeper, as if there was a pain he was trying to hide, but which was somehow reflected in the unexpected kindness of that gesture. "Okay," she murmured almost voicelessly. Jonathan motioned for her to follow him. He paid the bill quickly and led the 3 of them out, stopping only to call his driver, who followed him when he saw him with the 2 girls and was waiting in a shiny black car across the street. Grace hesitated at the sight of the luxurious vehicle. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her body, clearly uncomfortable with what it represented. Jonathan noticed her hesitation, but said nothing. He simply opened the door for them to enter, a gesture that seemed as natural to him as breathing. The girls woke up as they were put into the car. Their blue eyes widened at the sight of the spacious interior, with impeccable leather seats and a light, sophisticated scent that seemed to come from every corner. "This car is huge," exclaimed Chloe, while Clara nodded with a shy smile. Jonathan couldn't help but smile a little. "Wait till you see the house." As the car drove through the illuminated streets of New York, the girls were ecstatic. They pointed at the twinkling lights of the Christmas trees that decorated the parks. the store windows full of dolls and sleighs, and even the skyscrapers that seemed to touch the sky. "Look, Mum." Clara pointed to a huge decorated tree in the center of a square. "It's so beautiful." Grace tried to smile, but there was something in her gaze that betrayed the shame she felt. She knew Jonathan didn't expect anything in return, but the pride and humiliation of accepting help weighed heavily on her shoulders. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, looking at Jonathan. "We'd find somewhere to spend the night." Jonathan looked away from the window to stare at her. There was something cold and distant in his eyes, but also a hidden warmth that tried to manifest itself. "I know what it's like to be alone at Christmas," he replied simply. Grace wanted to ask more, but something in his voice stopped her. It was as if those few words carried a weight that she still didn't understand. When the car finally arrived at Jonathan's mansion, Grace was speechless. The property was magnificent, a work of modern art with imposing columns, huge windows that shone like stars under the decorative lights, and a large double door that looked like an entrance to another world. The girls were stunned, holding their mother's hands as they looked up in amazement. "Is this a real house?" asked Chloe, her eyes shining. Jonathan gave a slight smile. Welcome." The door was opened by an older woman with a gentle expression who seemed completely at ease with the grandeur around her. Helen, Jonathan's longtime housekeeper, looked at the girls with surprise, but then smiled warmly. "You got here quickly," she said to Jonathan as she helped him out of his coat. "I did as you asked. I've ordered a few things and the other part of the supper is being prepared, and I've put extra clothes in the guest rooms." "Thank you, Helen," replied Jonathan, before turning to Grace. "You'll feel right at home." Grace looked out of place as if she were walking in a dream. She wanted to protest, to say it was too much, but the girls' joy as they explored the main room was impossible to ignore. They ran from one side to the other, enchanted by the huge Christmas tree that decorated the center of the room, adorned with golden lights and crystal ornaments. "Can I touch it?" asked Clara, pointing to a shining star on the lowest branch. "Of course," replied Jonathan. She smiled shyly before touching the ornament, as if it was something magical. Grace watched everything with eyes full of tears that she struggled to hold back. Finally, she looked at Jonathan. "Thank you for doing this." He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the softly crackling fireplace. Finally, he replied, "No one should spend Christmas on the street, especially children." Grace realized that there was more to that answer than he was letting on, but decided not to press. She knew how difficult gratitude could be to put into words. While Helen showed the girls to their rooms and helped Grace with the warm clothes provided for the evening, Jonathan stood alone in the living room, staring at the Christmas tree. Chloe and Clara's faces were still fresh in his mind. Their joy, even in the midst of so much adversity, stirred something inside him that he thought was dead. He didn't understand why he felt this need to help, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. In the distance, he heard the girls' laughter echoing through the halls of the mansion. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, letting that sound fill the emptiness he was carrying. Something was changing, even if he still didn't know what it was. Jonathan, still unable to explain the depth of his actions, feels that the presence of Grace and the girls is awakening something he had buried long ago. However, what he will do with these newfound feelings is still a mystery. Jonathan Blake's mansion, which until a few hours ago seemed more like a cold, silent gallery, now pulsed with a different energy. The girls' laughter echoed through the corridors, mingling with the occasional sound of Helen's instructions, as she did her best to maintain order while overseeing the preparations. Jonathan, for his part, watched from a distance, an indecipherable expression on his face. He had the feeling that he was living a dream, one that he himself didn't know how it had started. Chloe and Clara's innocence, their wonder at the Christmas tree lights, and their uncomplicated joy made something inside him shudder. It had been so long since he had felt something so pure, so genuine, that he hardly knew how to react. Standing by the fireplace with his hands in his pockets, he watched Grace. They had already gone downstairs, and Grace was sitting on the sofa, helping the girls put on the thick socks Helen had brought. Her face still bore marks of tiredness, but there was a slight smile on her lips as she talked to her daughters. For the first time that evening, Jonathan realized the strength this woman carried. "Mr. Blake," Helen called out as she approached, "everything is in order, "Dinner will be served in an hour." He nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. "I'm going out for a while," he announced suddenly, reaching for his coat. Helen arched an eyebrow. "Going out? At this hour?" "I've got some things to sort out." Without waiting for an answer, Jonathan left, leaving Grace confused, and Helen, as always, ready to manage any situation. Jonathan drove alone through the brightly lit streets of New York, something he rarely did. He wasn't sure what motivated him, but the idea of doing something special for those children and for Grace drove him on. He stopped at a department store that was still open, something unusual for Christmas Eve. The place was almost empty, except for a few tired employees and the few customers who had left their shopping to the last minute. He walked through the aisles, choosing carefully. 2 identical dresses in soft, shiny fabric caught his eye for the girls. Shoes that matched, new coats, and toys. He didn't know what 6-year-old girls liked, so he picked up a doll, a teddy bear, and a puzzle. For Grace, he hesitated. He didn't know her well enough to know what would be appropriate, but he ended up choosing a simple but elegant red dress that seemed to reflect the dignity he saw in her. He also added a warm coat and a pair of gloves. When she passed a shop window displaying a delicate piece of jewelry, she stopped. It was a small necklace with a star-shaped pendant. Something about it felt right. He picked it up, feeling that it would be a special souvenir for Grace. On the way home, Jonathan made one last stop. He saw a small decoration store with flashing lights in the window and quickly went inside. Inside, he found a gold star to put on the top of the Christmas tree, something he had realized was missing. When he arrived at the mansion, Helen greeted him with a look of approval. "It looks like you've done a good job," she said, as she took the packages from his hands. Jonathan only smiled slightly. "The tree," he said. "We need to finish before dinner." Chloe and Clara were in the living room helping Helen organize the table for supper when Jonathan walked in with the gold star in his hands. Their eyes widened. "Is that for our tree?" asked Clara, running up to him. Jonathan nodded and the girls started jumping for joy. He helped them climb onto a small stool to place the star at the top of the tree. When they had finished, Chloe looked up at him with a smile that lit up her whole face. "It's perfect," she said. Grace watched from afar, her heart squeezing. That night was something she had never imagined for herself and her daughters. Jonathan seemed so distant and reserved, but his actions said much more than he let on. Finally, supper was ready. The long dining room table, which had remained unused for years, was now full of warm, colorful dishes. The girls were radiant in their new dresses, and Grace, who had been reluctant to accept the clothes Helen had brought her, looked almost uncomfortable in her own reflection in the mirror. "You look beautiful," said Helen, adjusting the star-shaped necklace around Grace's neck before leading her into the living room. As they all sat down, the moment seemed almost surreal. Grace tried to hold back tears as she watched her daughters laughing and eating, their sweet voices filling the space that had once seemed empty. "You didn't have to do that. But since you did, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart," Grace said to Jonathan at one point, her voice almost a whisper. "I know," he replied simply. After the meal, the girls asked to sing Christmas carols. Jonathan hesitated, but Helen, smiling, brought out an old songbook she had found somewhere in the house. Chloe and Clara began to sing, their pure voices filling the room with a joy that seemed impossible. "Come on, Mommy." Clara pulled Grace, who eventually joined them. Jonathan sat there watching in silence. There was something deeply touching about that scene, something that seemed to undo the years of ice he had built up around his heart. When Chloe and Clara had finished, they ran up to Jonathan. "You have to sing too," Chloe insisted, holding his hand. "Me? I'm no good at it," he replied, trying to avoid it. "Please." The look in their eyes was impossible to resist. He eventually gave in, and the girls' laughter when he started to sing was the most joyful sound he had heard in years. That night, while everyone was getting ready for bed, Jonathan stood in the living room, looking at the illuminated Christmas tree. He felt something he hadn't experienced for a long time: peace. But along with this peace came a restlessness. The presence of Grace and the girls brought up memories he had buried, especially about his own family. He knew that this night was just the beginning of something bigger, but he didn't know if he was ready for what came next. As Jonathan watches the tree lights flicker, he feels a doubt growing inside him. Does he really deserve this unexpected happiness? Or was his loneliness a choice he'll never be able to completely undo? Christmas morning came quietly and calmly, with soft rays of light penetrating the huge windows of Jonathan Blake's mansion. The cold still dominated outside, but inside the house there was a welcoming warmth, the result of the laughter, songs and unexpected connections of the night before. Jonathan woke up before everyone else. It wasn't unusual for him to start the day early, but this time something was different. He was restless. As he got up and put on a robe, he realized that the night before had stirred something in him that he couldn't ignore. He went downstairs in silence, avoiding the creaking of the steps. In the main room, the large Christmas tree was still glowing, the lights flickering softly in an almost hypnotic rhythm. Jonathan approached, looking at the presents the girls had opened the night before now scattered on the floor. Dolls, books, and a teddy bear lying on its side, forgotten during the evening's excitement. For a moment, he allowed himself to smile. It was as if life had returned to that house, filling a void he hadn't even known he felt. But soon the smile disappeared, replaced by a familiar weight: guilt. Jonathan sat down in an armchair next to the fireplace and ran his hands over his face. Old memories began to invade his mind, images of a past he had buried as deep as possible. It was Christmas many years ago, and Jonathan was still an ambitious young man, a recent Harvard graduate. The dining room of his parents' house was decorated with refinement, as always, but there was a tension in the air. His father, Richard Blake, a business tycoon, stared at him coldly. "Do you think you can just abandon everything we've built?" Richard's voice echoed. "I don't want your life, Dad," Jonathan replied, his own voice filled with anger and frustration. "I want to build something of my own, something that means something to me." "Mean something?" Richard laughed bitterly. "You only have the luxury of dreaming because of what I've built. Make no mistake, Jonathan, without this name, you're nothing." His father's words were like stabs. His mother, Evelyn, tried to intervene, asking for calm, but Jonathan had already gotten up from the table. "If that's what you think, then maybe I'd better go," he said before leaving. The door slammed, and that was the last Christmas he would ever spend with his family. Back in the present, Jonathan felt his eyes sting with tears that he had refused to shed for years. He realized now how much that choice had cost him. The loneliness he had attributed to chance was actually the result of his own pride. The sound of soft footsteps brought him out of his thoughts. He looked up and saw Grace entering the room, her hands holding a mug of coffee. She stopped at the sight of him, hesitating. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she said, her voice soft. "You're not disturbing," he replied, gesturing for her to sit down. Grace approached, still cautious. "The girls are still asleep. They were so happy yesterday. I can't remember the last time I saw them so excited." Jonathan nodded, looking at the tree again. "They're amazing children." Grace smiled, but there was something in her gaze that showed concern. "I still can't thank you enough for what you've done for us." He shook his head. "No need to thank me. Just, accept it. That's enough." She watched him for a moment before speaking. "You're a very generous man, Jonathan, but I feel you're carrying something. Something heavy." Jonathan didn't reply immediately. He knew Grace was right, but admitting it out loud was a battle he wasn't sure he was ready to face. "Grace," he began, looking away. "Last night I realized something I'd been ignoring for a long time. My life has been empty, but you brought something here, something I thought I'd lost." Before she could reply, he suddenly stood up. "I need to do something." Grace sat there, confused, while Jonathan hurried up the stairs. In his office, Jonathan picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. His heart beat fast as the tone echoed. After a few seconds, a voice answered. "Hello?" It was his mother. Jonathan almost lost his voice but managed to speak. "Mom, it's me." There was a silence on the other end, followed by a shaky inhale. "Jonathan, is that you?" "Yes," he replied, feeling his throat tighten. I know it's been a long time, and that I made a mistake, but I wanted to apologize." His mother began to cry, and Jonathan felt the tears running down his own face. "Jonathan, you have no idea how long I've waited for this call, how much we miss you. Your father, he may not show it, but he misses you so much." "I miss you too," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I let pride blind me, and it cost me so much. I want to make things right. I want to be with you again." The conversation continued, full of tears, regrets, and promises of a new beginning. When he finally hung up, he felt lighter than he had in years. Jonathan went downstairs with renewed purpose. He found Grace and the girls in the living room, the twins still enraptured by the ornaments on the tree. "Grace," he began, catching her eye, "I have something for you." She looked at him in surprise. He took a small envelope out of his pocket and handed it to her. Grace opened it, and inside were the keys to an apartment. This is for you and the girls," he said. "A place to call home. It's not permanent, but it's a start." Grace was stunned, speechless. "Jonathan, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "And one more thing, I want you to work with me. I'll give you a job in my company, something that will allow you to start again, with dignity." The tears came immediately. Grace tried to speak, but the words got stuck in her throat. The twins ran to Jonathan, hugging him tightly. Thank you," they said in unison as he held them, feeling a wave of emotion that almost knocked him over. At that moment, Jonathan realized something that changed everything. Love, that feeling he had rejected for so long, was the true force that transformed lives, and now he was learning to let that love guide him again. As Jonathan watched Grace and the girls smiling, he felt an idea take shape. Perhaps this was just the first of many actions he could take to change not only his life, but other people's too. Christmas, after all, is a time for miracles. The soft aroma of coffee filled the Christmas morning air in Jonathan Blake's mansion as he prepared for something that had seemed impossible for years. After the emotional conversation with his mother, a whirlwind of emotions took over his mind. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope, and also the weight of what he had lost. Grace and the girls were in the living room, admiring the minute details of the Christmas tree, still overjoyed at Jonathan's generosity. The twins were playing with the newly given toys, their laughter echoing through the house, while Grace, sitting in a corner, watched with a discreet smile. Jonathan entered the room with firm steps, but there was a tenderness in his expression that no one there had ever seen before. "Grace," he called softly. She looked up, surprised by the warmth in his voice. "I want you and the girls to stay for Christmas lunch. It would be special to have you here." Grace hesitated. "Jonathan, you've already done so much for us. I don't want to be a burden." He shook his head firmly. "You're not a burden. In fact, I'd like you to be here. But I need to go away for a while. I have something important to do." Before Grace could ask any more, Jonathan grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Jonathan drove through the snow-covered streets, his hands firmly on the steering wheel as his thoughts consumed him. It had been years since he had last visited his parents' house. He didn't even know how he would be received, but the desire to make amends for the past was stronger than any fear. When he parked in front of the house where he grew up, he stood still for a moment, looking at the Christmas lights hanging in the windows. Nostalgia hit him like a wave, bringing back childhood memories, of laughter, of jokes, and of a time when the love in his family seemed unshakable. He took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. The door was opened by his mother, Evelyn Blake, who stopped when she saw him. Her eyes filled with tears almost immediately. "Jonathan?" "Hi, Mom," he said with a shy smile. I know it's been a long time." Evelyn pulled him into a tight hug before he could finish. "How you don't know how long I've waited for this." He returned the hug, feeling the emotion rise in his chest. When they pulled away, he saw tears streaming down her face. "Is Dad home?" Jonathan asked, his voice low. Evelyn's face changed slightly, a shadow of concern crossing her eyes. "Yes, he is, but he's not well, Jonathan." Jonathan felt his heart squeeze. He followed his mother into the living room, where he found his father, Richard Blake, sitting in an armchair, wrapped in a blanket. The man who had always been so imposing now looked frail, his skin pale and his eyes tired. "Dad," Jonathan called softly. Richard looked up, and for a moment, a flash of surprise shone in his eyes. "Jonathan?" Jonathan knelt beside the armchair, feeling the tears coming. "Dad, I'm so sorry for everything, for leaving, for pushing me away. I should have been here." Richard looked at him for a long moment, before reaching out with a trembling hand and touching him on the shoulder. "I was wrong too, son. I was too hard, and I lost you." Evelyn cried softly as she watched her husband and son finally reconcile. Jonathan held his father's hand carefully, feeling the weight of regret they both carried. "Come with me," Jonathan said at last. "I want you to spend the rest of the day with me and some special people I've met." Evelyn nodded, touched, and helped Richard to his feet. Jonathan guided them to the car, watching his father's every step with patience and tenderness. When they arrived at the mansion, Evelyn was stunned. "Jonathan, did you build all this by yourself?" He smiled, helping Richard out of the car. "Yes, Mum. But today I realized that none of this matters without you." They went inside, and Grace was in the living room with the girls, organizing the toys. When she saw Jonathan entering with his parents, she immediately stood up, nervously fixing her hair. "Grace," Jonathan called out, smiling, "these are my parents, Evelyn and Richard." Evelyn approached, smiling at Grace and the girls. "And who are these lovely girls?" "Chloe and Clara," replied Grace, touching her daughter's shoulders. Evelyn smiled, delighted. "You're beautiful." Jonathan looked at Grace, noticing her discomfort. "Grace and the girls are my guests. They taught me something important, about what it means to share Christmas." Before Grace could reply, the door opened again. Jonathan's brothers began to arrive, accompanied by their families. They were clearly surprised to see Jonathan with their parents. "Jonathan," called his older brother Matthew, coming up for a hug, "you finally decided to come out of hiding." Jonathan laughed, feeling strangely at ease. Soon everyone was gathered in the living room, the children playing while the adults chatted. Jonathan's brothers looked at Grace and the girls, and Matthew finally commented with a raised eyebrow, "So, Jonathan, do you have a family now?" Grace turned red. "Oh no, that's not it. Jonathan he helped us. He saved me and my daughters when we needed it most." She told the story with tears streaming down her face about how Jonathan had found them the night before and given them shelter, clothes, and even a new start. The room was silent as she spoke, and when she finished, Evelyn wiped her tears away with a handkerchief, while Richard nodded in respect. "Jonathan," Evelyn said, her voice breaking, "you've become an incredible man. I'm so proud of you." Helen, who was watching from afar, smiled. For the first time in years, the mansion was full of laughter, love, and hope. And Jonathan, surrounded by his family and his new friends, realized that Christmas had given him something he thought he had lost forever: a home. As everyone gathered for Christmas lunch, Jonathan looked around, feeling complete. He knew that this was just the beginning of something bigger, a new life full of love, forgiveness, and endless possibilities. The sound of voices filling the mansion was something Jonathan Blake hadn't heard for years. The main room was filled with laughter, conversation, and the occasional sound of toys being pushed around by the twins, Chloe and Clara, as they explored the house with the other children. The aroma of Christmas dinner, now transformed into a special lunch, wafted through the house, creating a welcoming contrast to the cold outside. Jonathan was standing in the doorway to the dining room, watching the scene with a slight smile. His parents were sitting on the sofa, with Grace by their side, chatting like old friends. Helen, always efficient, was overseeing the details of the dining table, making sure that every dish was perfect. Jonathan's siblings and their families were also part of the moment, as if the years of distance had never existed. "Jonathan," his mother's voice called out, bringing him back to the present. He approached, taking a seat in an armchair next to her. Evelyn held his hand, something she hadn't done since he was young. I still can't believe we're all here together after so many years. It's a miracle." Jonathan looked at her, his eyes watering. "Mum, I'm sorry for everything, for pulling away, for not being with you when you needed me." Evelyn squeezed his hand tighter. "The past doesn't matter anymore, my son. What matters is that we are united here now. And that's all I've ever wanted." The moment was interrupted by the twins, who ran up to Jonathan holding drawings they had done with some of the children. "Look, Jonathan, it's you," said Chloe, showing a colourful drawing of a tall figure next to two girls and a woman. Jonathan smiled and took the paper. "It looks amazing. I'm going to keep this." Clara approached, looking at him with a shy smile. "You're like a hero, you know that?" The girl's words struck Jonathan deeply. He had never seen himself like this, but the innocence and sincerity in her eyes made him believe, at least for a moment, that he was on the right track. When the food was finally served, everyone gathered around the long dining room table. The table was decorated with Christmas decorations, golden candles and dishes impeccably arranged by Helen, who, despite being discreet, couldn't hide the sparkle of happiness in her eyes at seeing the house so alive again. Richard Blake, who was usually reserved, looked around before speaking. His voice was weak but carried a weight of emotion that no one expected. "Before we start," he said, "I want to say something." Everyone was silent, attentive. Jonathan felt his heart race as he heard his father's voice, which he hadn't heard for so long. "Jonathan," Richard continued, looking directly at him, "I was a strict father. I always demanded more than was perhaps fair. And that's why I lost you." Jonathan tried to interrupt, but Richard held up his hand to make him wait. "I'm not in the best of health," he said with painful honesty, "and over the last few years I've had a lot of time to think about how I was too proud to apologize. But today here I want to say that I'm sorry and that I'm very proud of the man you've become. I could have come to you, but I was too afraid of how you would react. I didn't want any more pain for me and your mother." The words broke something inside Jonathan. He swallowed, fighting back tears, but he couldn't hold them back. He stood up, walked over to his father, and hugged him tightly. "I'm sorry too, Dad," he said, his voice breaking. "I was stubborn, proud. I should have come back sooner." Evelyn cried silently as she watched the scene, and Matthew, Jonathan's older brother, bowed his head, touched by the emotion of the moment. "We're here now," said Richard, squeezing Jonathan's shoulder, "and that's what matters." When they finally started eating, the conversation flowed naturally. Grace, initially shy, was included in the conversation by Jonathan's brothers, who were curious about the details of how she and the girls had come into his life and changed his heart. "It's an incredible story," said Grace, looking at Jonathan with a grateful smile. "He met us in the street last night and changed everything. He gave us hope again." Evelyn put her hand over Grace's. Her eyes filled with tears. "My son is amazing. It's like his heart is back to being that sweet little boy who always wanted to help others." Jonathan smiled, a little embarrassed, but touched by his mother's words. "Grace," began Evelyn, "you and your daughters are a gift to us too. Thank you for bringing back that side of him." Grace looked at Jonathan, her emotions overflowing. "I'm the one to thank. Not only did he save us, but he gave us a new start. I don't know how to repay him." "You already have," said Jonathan softly. The twins, who couldn't sit still for long, started pulling the adults into play after lunch. Jonathan found himself running around the house with the girls, something he never imagined he would do. The sound of laughter filled every corner of the mansion, and even Richard, sitting in his chair, seemed more alive than ever, watching his grandchildren and the twins with a genuine smile. Helen, who had retired to the kitchen, was watching everything through the ajar door. She wiped away a tear that had escaped from her eye, whispering to herself, "That's what this house needed. That's what he needed." As the afternoon drew to a close, everyone gathered in the main room again. Evelyn picked up an old photo of Jonathan when he was a boy and started telling funny stories about his childhood. The atmosphere was full of warmth and love, like a true celebration of what Christmas represented. Jonathan watched everything, feeling a deep sense of relief and joy that he hadn't experienced for a long time. He realized that he didn't need anything else. This moment, his family together, Grace and the girls happy, was all that mattered. Jonathan looked at Grace, then at his parents and siblings, and realized that he had a new mission. He wanted to ensure that moments like that became more frequent, not just for him, but for others who also needed a second chance. A new chapter was about to begin, and he knew that the future was full of possibilities. Night fell softly over Jonathan Blake's mansion, the Christmas tree lights glowing with a magical softness in the main room. The afternoon had been filled with laughter, touching conversations, and the genuine joy of a family that had remained fragmented for so long. Now it was time to say goodbye, and a feeling of peace hung in the air. Evelyn and Richard were standing by the door, their faces illuminated by an expression of tranquility and gratitude. Jonathan was helping them with their coats, making sure Richard was well warmed up. "Jonathan," said Richard, holding his son's arm as he adjusted his scarf, "I'll never forget this day nor what you did for us. It doesn't matter how much time we've lost, son. The important thing is that we're together now." Jonathan nodded, his throat tight. "I should have come back sooner. Thank you for welcoming me back." Evelyn hugged Jonathan tightly, as if she didn't want to let him go. "You'll always be our boy, Jonathan. I'm so proud of the man you've become." Matthew, the older brother, approached to shake Jonathan's hand but ended up pulling him into a hug. "Don't disappear again, okay? We've got a lot of catching up to do." Jonathan laughed softly, returning the gesture. "I promise. I'll be part of the family again." The brothers' children said goodbye with hugs for the twins, promising to play more on a future visit. Chloe and Clara, already tired, hugged Evelyn and Richard affectionately, calling them Grandpa and Grandma to everyone's surprise and delight. With a final wave, the cars drove off, taking Jonathan's parents and siblings back to their homes. He stood in the driveway, watching the rear lights disappear into the distance. Next to him, Grace was silent, respecting the moment. "It was the most special Christmas I've ever had," Jonathan said softly, more to himself than to Grace. She looked at him, smiling. "For me too, thank you for including us in it." He turned to her, his eyes fixed on hers for a moment longer than usual. "You're an important part of it all, Grace. Don't ever doubt that." Later that evening, Jonathan helped Grace and the girls prepare for the move. He insisted on driving the three of them personally to the apartment he had prepared for them. The car glided through the silent streets of New York, the city lights reflecting in the snow that was beginning to fall again. When they arrived at the building, Grace was impressed. It was a modern building with an elegant but welcoming facade. Jonathan carried the suitcases, while Grace guided the sleepy girls to the elevator. The apartment was a dream, small but cozy, with new furniture, delicate curtains, and even a Christmas tree twinkling in the corner of the living room. Chloe and Clara looked around in delight and rushed to the bedrooms, exploring every detail before finally falling asleep in their freshly made beds. Jonathan and Grace sat on the sofa in the living room, the comfortable silence filling the space between them. "You thought of everything," said Grace, looking around. "I can't thank you enough." Jonathan shook his head, his gaze fixed on the carpet. "No need to thank me. This is just the beginning." She tilted her head, puzzled. "The beginning of what?" He sighed deeply, choosing his words carefully. "When I met you and the girls that night, something inside me changed. I realized how there are people out there who need help, people who perhaps weren't as lucky as I was. I can't ignore that." Grace watched him intently, her admiration growing with every word. "I want to start a project," he continued, turning to face her. "Something to help people in vulnerable situations, homeless people, families like yours. I want to create a place where they can find shelter, food, and a chance to start again, but I can't do it alone." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Are you serious?" "More than ever," he replied. "And I want you to be my partner in this. You know this reality better than anyone. Together we can make a difference." Grace put her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the tears. "Jonathan, I don't know what to say. Of course I want to. It's all I've ever dreamed of, helping people." They were silent for a moment, the weight of the promise between them filling the room. Jonathan looked at Grace, realizing for the first time how incredible she was. Her strength, resilience, and kindness were inspiring. "You're an incredible woman, Grace," he said at last. She blushed slightly, looking away. "You're amazing too, Jonathan. You just don't realize it yet." Over the next few weeks, Jonathan immersed himself in the project, with Grace by his side. The girls, Chloe and Clara, spent a lot of time at the mansion, while their mother worked with Jonathan, filling the place with laughter and joy. Helen, always observant, noticed the change in her boss with a discreet smile. The atmosphere between Jonathan and Grace began to change. They began to share moments of complicity, exchanging smiles and deep conversations about what motivated them. Jonathan realized that, for the first time in years, he was allowing someone into his heart. Grace also felt something blossom. Jonathan wasn't just a generous man, he was someone who had suffered and found the strength to change. She admired him deeply, and this admiration was beginning to turn into something more. On New Year's Eve, Jonathan, Grace, and the girls organized the project's first action. They took to the streets, handing out presents, blankets, and hot meals to homeless people. The girls were overjoyed, handing out toys and wishing Happy New Year to everyone they met. As the snow fell softly around them, Jonathan felt something he had never felt before: fullness. He looked at Grace, who was standing next to him, helping an elderly woman put on new boots. "Thank you," he said suddenly. She stared at him in surprise. "For what?" "For showing me what love is," he replied, his voice low but full of emotion. Grace smiled, her eyes shining. "You always knew. You just needed a nudge to remember." Chloe and Clara ran up to them, pulling them to another part of the street where more people needed help. Jonathan looked at the girls, at Grace and at the falling snow, and felt that his life had finally made sense. The smile on his face was a reflection of his transformation from a bitter, lonely man to someone who had found the true meaning of Christmas: love, forgiveness, and human connection. And so, with the snow gently falling and hearts warmed by love and hope, the story of Jonathan, Grace, and the adorable twins comes to an end. A journey of redemption, unity, and touching discoveries that show how Christmas can transform lives. If you were moved by this story and believe in the power of love and human connection, please like and rate this story. This will help more people find this video and feel the same warmth in their hearts that you have just felt. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any stories like this. Here, we always try to bring emotion, inspiration, and messages that touch the soul. And of course, we want to wish you and your family a Merry Christmas full of love, unity, and hope. May this date be a special time to reflect on the things that really matter. Now click on the next video that appears on your screen and continue to be moved by more incredible stories like this one. We're sure you'll love them. Until next time, and Merry Christmas.